How's it going, Guardians? Welcome back to the third video in the series of optimizing Destiny 2. This video is the first of a three-parter in and of itself, and it's knowing your gear. This video in particular will be looking at the weapons, the following video will be looking at armor, and the last video in this will be looking specifically at exotics. So keep that in mind, the exotics will be completely separate. We might touch or talk about a few in this video and the next one, but the majority of those will be touched on in the third and final video of the three-parter on knowing your gear. Now, like I said, this will be exclusively looking at legendary weapons, and then we'll move on to other topics as we see fit. But each of these videos will be very intertwined and connected, so if there's something that's confusing, I highly recommend going back and watching all three of them, so if this is something you're watching in the future, make sure you go back through and watch all of it, and if there's something that you're confused about elsewhere, watch the first two videos in the series and see if the answer is in one of those, and if it's not, feel free to leave a comment down below and I will look into it. Now let's jump into the weapons that Destiny 2 has to offer. There are a number of different weapons and weapon archetypes inside Destiny 2, not even mentioning affinities yet. Additionally, there are 3 ammo types, so there's a lot of different variety inside the game when it comes to weapons specifically. Now I'm going to start by reminding you of the 5 main categories that we established that each weapon falls into, and this is from the previous video. We have add clear, damage, champion, utility, and lastly a miscellaneous category. So add clear, let's start there. Very, very simple. We're going to give an outline of each of these and then go into a bit more depth looking at each weapon in particular and where its roles are best defined. Add clear weapons, well, as the name entails, allow you to clear large waves of adds very, very effectively, or quickly for that matter. Damage. Any sort of damage weapon, well, this is going to be exclusive for damaging a boss, mini-boss, or perhaps another enemy type in the game that has a large amount of health. Champion. Can be very similar to damage weapons for one reason, and that would be damaging champions, as champions can be rather tanky. But these weapons, realistically, are also used for stunning said champion. So keep in mind it can be stunning or dealing damage to said champion. Utility. Utility weapons are very, very specific and not used as much as one would think. Oftentimes, these are used to activate an objective, whether it's a node, a panel, used in some sort of puzzle, found in a raid or a dungeon. That's what utility weapons are mostly used for. Lastly, we have miscellaneous. Now, this category is a bit of an exception, and I could really rename it if I wanted, but I feel like I need to leave this category open in case there are other things that could be put in here. In the exotic list, we'll see a lot more of the miscellaneous than anything else. But this category is typically for weapons that have movement capabilities, buffing capabilities, or allow for some sort of oob mechanic inside the game, and they don't fit in any of the other 4 categories all that well. So now that we've established the 5 categories each weapon type may fall into, let's go through each single weapon type and archetype and list some of the best options if there are any. Keep in mind, my goal with this entire video and these next 3 videos is to give a newer player or a player that is new to endgame content inside Destiny 2 a list of very solid weapons and some of their uses. So it'll allow you to focus your farming and your grinding inside Destiny. With a lot of that out of the way, let's jump right in, starting with primary ammo weapons, looking at auto rifles. So like I said before, we're going to be starting with auto rifles, but this goes for all primary ammo weapons. Keep in mind that these are really going to be responsible for 2 of our 5 categories. The first being add clear. It makes sense, right? Although, let me specify that a majority of the primary ammo weapons we have in this game are really not all that efficient at add clear these days, as we have special ammo weapons or heavy ammo weapons that deal more damage per bullet or have perks that destroy a whole wave of adds without any issue. But they're definitely more often than not going to be used for general add clear. Keep in mind that a number of these weapons, season to season, will also be champion stunning weapons, which is something that realistically they're going to be most used for in endgame sort of content. And then very lastly, there is a little bit of utility. Some of these weapons will replace special ammo weapons, which we'll talk about later in the list, but they are very, very easily used to activate a node or a panel or whatever it may be in some sort of puzzle encounter. So let's jump into it, looking at auto rifles first. There's 4 different frame types: high impact, precision, adaptives, and rapid fires. Looking at high impacts, I'm going to list 2, Abyss Defiant and Age Old Bond. By no means are these the best of the best, but they're the best high impacts, if that makes sense. Moving on to precision frames, I'm only going to list 1, Ahmed AR2. Very, very simple. Then we have adaptives, which is slowly getting better and better. Perpetualis and Gnawing Hunger are the 2 that I'd recommend. And then lastly, if you're going to be using an auto rifle, I highly recommend that it be a rapid fire frame. And the 2 that I recommend you going after are Rufus's Fury and Sweet Sorrow, 2 incredible rapid fire auto rifles. Moving on to bows, there are only 2 weapon archetypes of bows, but keep in mind they're kind of interchangeable and you're going to pick what you like best. The precision archetype has Under Your Skin and Pre-Astenix 4, and the lightweight archetype has Fell Taradiddle and Tripwire Canary. Once again, pick what feels best to you. Bows really don't see much play except for in a handful of GMs, so realistically not something you're going to be going after a whole lot. Hand cannons, which recently got a very large buff, have 4 archetypes as well: aggressive, adaptive, precision, and heavy burst. 3 of these are more or less useless, with only 1 archetype being important whatsoever. So aggressive frame, more or less useless, but round robin is something you could use if you really want. Precision frame, also useless. Word of Crota is my recommendation. Heavy burst with Warden's Law. Obviously there is only 1 heavy burst currently in the game, but still. But that means that the adaptive frame is the archetype of hand cannon I think is worth your time. And let me just say, hand cannons feel really, really good right now. And these are 3 of the best, or 3 of the ones that I use the most: Fatebringer, Nation of Beasts, and Zaouli's Bane. Incredible hand cannons, and I totally recommend you go and give them a try. Hand cannons, as far as primary ammo weapons go in this game, are some of the best at ad clear right now and deal a lot of damage to majors as well. So very, very important that you have a good hand cannon ready to go. Pulse rifles, we have 5 archetypes: high impact, adaptive, lightweight, aggressive, and rapid fire. Now pulse rifles are a little bit of a toss up. I'm going to list 2 of the archetypes as quote unquote the best and list a number of options for each. We'll go through high impact. I don't believe there is a single high impact scout rifle or pulse rifle, in this game that is worth your time. I'm going to be completely honest. Not for endgame PvE. For adaptives, I think Smite of Moraine is by far one of the best, and in my opinion, it's probably the best scout or pulse rifle in the entire game, but it just doesn't have the frame to really boost it. For lightweights, which I would say is tied for first in the pulse rifle category, we have the BXR Battler, the Ogma PR6, and Chattering Bone, all incredible options, 2 of which are craftable, and 1 of which just has some very unique perk combinations. The other one that is tied for first would be the aggressive frame, with Disparity and Insidious being the 2 that I would recommend in this regard. The aggressive frame is shooting that 4-round burst, and it staggers enemies very, very easily. Moving lastly on to rapid fires, once again, more or less not recommended in endgame content, but I would feel remiss if I didn't put at least something. So I'm going to say Jurassic Green. Jurassic Green is currently out with Festival of the Lost and has some unique roles. And while it's not the best of the best when it comes to pulse rifles, it's definitely got some unique roles and some that are worthwhile. Moving on to scout rifles, we also have 5 frames: aggressive, high impact, precision, lightweight, and rapid fire. I'm only going to be listing 1 of these archetypes as the best, and keep in mind 2 of them are more or less useless when it comes to endgame content in PvE for Destiny 2. The aggressive and high impact frames have very few weapons or very few scout rifles to choose from, and the ones that we can choose from, well, they're not particularly great. The precision archetype is a close second, in my opinion, and it has weapons such as the Hung Jury SR4 and Vision of Confluence, or as many of us know it, Vision of Cornflakes. I believe the precision archetype is better, but that's technically not the case on paper. I just think they feel better, and I like those 2 weapons a little bit more is all. The lightweight archetype is by far the fan favorite and is the best when it comes to scout rifles. The 3 that I would recommend going out of your way to get are Night Watch, which is given in the New Light campaign, Vouchsafe, and Tarnished Metal. Lastly, we have the rapid fire archetype, which has Trusty and Fangavir Ute in it. This is that fast firing with very, very low damage profile. And to be honest, I wouldn't have included these, but there are a number of people out there that would claim rapid fires feel very, very good in endgame content. I just don't see it. So I had to put two on here, two fan favorites at that. Moving on to sidearms, we're getting into our close range options. We have 6 different archetypes: precision, adaptive, aggressive burst, lightweight, rapid fire, and adaptive burst. Starting with precision, ignore it. There's not a single sidearm in this game that is a precision frame that is worth your time for endgame content. Adaptive frames, I believe we have Buzzard and Drang as 2 very, very good options, and I would say these are definitely your second best option when it comes to sidearms and endgame content. But as for the first, it's going to have to go to aggressive burst. I believe that Liminal Vigil and Forgiveness are both great examples of this, and while we don't have a sidearm, in my opinion, that has that perfect god roll for an aggressive burst sidearm, when it does happen to drop, the aggressive burst frame on the sidearm of that sidearm, whatever its role may be, will be very, very well used. Lightweights, once again, a waste of your time, in my opinion. I absolutely adore the lightweight sidearms in Crucible, but in PvE, they are just simply put, not worth your time. The rapid fire frames, we really have very limited options, but I believe that one of the best sidearms in the entire game sits in this archetype, and that is Brigand's Law. Rapid fires are very unique for PvE and endgame content as a whole, but Brigand's Law fills a very, very large niche and has some incredible perk combinations. Lastly, we have the Adaptive Burst, which is, in my opinion, one buff away from being by far the best sidearm archetype, but where it sits right now, it's just nothing crazy, and that would be Peace Bond. Peace Bond has some very unique roles such as Subsistence, Headstone, and maybe when we get a buff with Headstone, then this sidearm would be even better. But overall, these are the 6, and I would recommend Aggressive Burst over anything else, followed by Adaptives. Now lastly, we have a fan favorite of the primary MO weapon types, and that would be SMGs. And while I can't definitively say that there's one of the best, I'm going to say that there's really a first and a second place, and there's 2 archetypes on each. So let's start with the second place. We have precision and adaptive frames on opposite ends of the spectrum. The slowest firing, one of the fastest firing. I'm going to list for precision Unending Tempest, and for adaptive, the Hero's Burden. Keep in mind, they're just better options all around. So sure, these are good SMGs, but there are better things. Moving on to tied for first, we have aggressive and lightweight. Surprise, surprise. Now here's where it really comes down to personal preference. Same as before, you pick what feels best to you. In my honest opinion, for aggressive frames, we have Immortal, Ikelos, and Unforgiven. And for the lightweight side of things, we have Funnel Web, Callous Mini Tool, and Submission. Now, like I said, pick what feels best to you. Of the 6 SMGs on here, all of them are fantastic, and you're not going to receive crap for running any of them. Now we're going to move on to special ammo weapons, and I'm going to take the time because there's a lot of variety within this. So some archetypes or some weapon types in the special ammo have different roles. So let's start with fusion rifles. Fusion rifles are going to be used for realistically 2 main things in this game, and maybe a third, which is tied into the second. The first is going to be damage, and more specifically major damage. Not necessarily a boss, but maybe it is in a swap rotation, or maybe you're the Galahorn user and you're running a specific fusion rifle for that. But they deal really good damage to champions and bosses and mini bosses as far as a special weapon goes, which is very, very unique. But the other thing that they would see a little bit of playtime with is ad clear, as they have things, certain perk selections that go very, very crazy, and it is specific fusion rifles that do that. So there are 5 archetypes. We have high impact, a frame that I'm not even going to take the time to look at, but I believe is aggressive, precision, adaptive, and rapid fire. The high impacts and the rapid fires are going to be some of the best to pick from, in my opinion. Your high impacts with Eremite, Loaded Question, Nox Perennial 5. These are amazing for extra damage with things like Controlled Burst on them. The aggressive frame there's only one in the game. It's the fusion rifle from Europa, and it is a complete waste of your time. Do not go after it. Maybe in the future when we get a new A new fusion rifle that fills that frame and has some good perks, it'll see a different play, but for the time being, not worth it. Precision frames, I'm only going to recommend one, and that's Deliverance, and purely because it has Chill Clip and Surrounded, two incredible perks, and I absolutely love having Demo in the third column. Adaptive, I'm going to recommend one as well, and that would be Royal Executioner. This has a very, very unique role of Envious Assassin and Reservoir Burst, allowing for a lot of reservoir shots, and I very much enjoy it. Lastly, we have rapid fire frames, like I said, tied for that first place, ones that I'd recommend. And I'm only going to recommend two instead of the three that I did for high impact, and those two would be Cartesian Coordinate and Riptide, filling two very different roles, whether it's champion stunning or dealing damage to champions, but Cartesian is also very, very good at dealing boss damage, or mini boss damage for that matter. Moving on to glaives, there are technically three archetypes, but with a majority of the glaives being in one of them. We have the aggressive frames, the adaptive frames, and the rapid fire frames. Now, let me just be completely honest. The rapid fire frames feel very, very nice and snappy, but don't deal enough damage, in my opinion, for their shot. The aggressive frames are going to be one of the best, in my opinion, but we only have one, so it's really tough to say. And then the adaptives are where most of the glaives are going to be sitting. So rapid fire, we're going to list Greasy Luck, the one and only option. Aggressive frames, which I would say go after first, Judgment of Kelgaroth, a phenomenal glaive at that. And then adaptive frames, where you'll see a lot more perk diversity and a lot more interesting combinations, but feel really, really good still. And that'd be Ecliptic Distaff and Unexpected Resurgence. Keep in mind with glaives, these are going to be mainly for ad clear and perhaps a little bit of miscellaneous, as they do have a blocking mechanic which can be used in certain builds. But beyond that, they're not going to be used for damage, and they're really infrequently used for champion stunning. Occasionally, if Unstoppable Glaive is on their list. But Judgment of Kelgaroth is by far the one I would recommend going after. Next, we have a fan favorite of special weapons, and that's grenade launchers. You knew it was coming. There are three archetypes, and I'm going to be completely honest. Each does something very, very different, so recommend looking at all of them and getting all of the grenade launchers that I recommend. Let's start with the most popular, waveframes. Waveframes, I'm going to recommend two in particular, but just know that all waveframes in this game are very, very good. And the two that I'm going to recommend are New Pacific Epitaph, that sits in your kinetic slot, that is Stasis, and Forbearance, as it has chain reaction on it. It's a no-brainer. Waveframes are amazing for ad clear, and that is where it starts and ends. And then we have Lightweight and Double Fire. Now, Lightweight and Double Fire are going to fill a little bit of a different niche, and depending on their roles, can be very good with ad clear, but also are very good at damage and champion. But not so much for utility, and there is one exception for miscellaneous, which I'll explain in a second. Our lightweights that I'm going to recommend are Partner Dust, Lingering Dread, and Salvager's Salvo. And then for the Double Fire, we only currently have one in the game, and that's Wilder Flight, but it is a banger of a grenade launcher and has some incredible perks on it. Like I said before, these are going to be supplementary damage options, including champions, as well as the fact that many of them, such as Salvager's Salvo, have incredible ad clear capabilities as well, although not as great as waveframes. Now, like I said, I would put one grenade launcher in that miscellaneous slot, and that would happen to be Mountaintop, and strictly for some movement capabilities. Let's move on to shotguns. Shotguns, well, there's 5 archetypes, and there's a lot to unpack here. We have aggressive, pinpoint slug, precision, lightweight, and rapid fire. Now keep in mind, shotguns have a very weird spot in the meta when it comes to endgame content inside Destiny 2. Typically, they're going to be used for 1-2 punch. However, there's a number of others that allow for quick swapping between 1 or 2 shotguns, as well as a heavy weapon that works in order for very, very quick rotation of weapons and a high DPS standard. For aggressives, I'm only going to list Found Verdict, but keep in mind aggressive swapping is a thing, so any aggressive frame that sits in the kinetic slot that has good damage perks and something like either auto-loading, or in the future if we get one with reconstruction, would be absolutely important. Pinpoint slugs are definitely a fan favorite and have been in the Destiny community for a long time. They deal a lot of damage as long as you're hitting precision shots, and are usually the standard when it comes to swapping. So the 3 that I'm going to list are Heritage, Nessa's Oblation, and First In Last Out. Keep in mind there are others, but Heritage and Nessa's Oblation are definitely 2 of the favorites, purely because they have reconstruction on them. As for precision frames, I really don't see much use. They're great for swapping, and they do really, really good damage, just like lightweights in that regard. But there's not a ton to pick from, in my opinion, that are really all that that work all that well. Moving on to lightweights, I'm going to list 3. Keep in mind that 2 of the 3 here are really only used for 1-2 punch, but the one that's not is Without Remorse. The 2 that are going to be Wastelander, M5, and Swordbreaker. All incredible shotguns and all fill a different role. Now, moving on to the last one, we have rapid fire frames. Now, rapid fire frames, in my opinion, are some of the most fun in the entire game and ones that I definitely use the most. And they can fill a large number of roles, whether it is damage, champion stunning, or champion damage, as well as the fact that a number of them fill that miscellaneous category by buffing your damage via 1-2 punch. So we have Until Its Return, Deadweight, and Ikelos. 3 incredible shotguns. 3 incredible shotguns, and I recommend taking the time to get the 2 that are craftable and getting a good deadweight, which I know entails playing Gambit, and I'm sorry about that. Moving on to sniper rifles, we go back to our 3-frame standard. We have aggressive, adaptive, and rapid fire. The aggressive frames are going to hit very, very hard, and realistically, there's only one option in this, and you should know it by now, and that's succession. However, a close second that I'm going to list that I've been playing with a decent amount is Luna Regolith 3. And this is from that Vanguard playlist activity, and it's got some very unique roles on it. It's going to take some time to get the God roll. Then we have adaptives. Adaptives that I'm going to list are Fugue 55 and Thoughtless. They're both very good snipers and fill that like medium damage role or a swap role. But they don't really excel at anything in particular except for use in the Crucible. Then lastly, the ones that you are going to want to spend most of your time going after, once again, is the rapid fires. Rapid fires feel very, very good in this game, and rapid fire sniper rifles in particular allow for some of the best swapping opportunities, as well as the fact that they have some very unique secondary damage options here. So sniper rifles as a whole are mainly going to be used for damage and very, very limited champion damage / stunning, and that is where it starts and ends. We don't really have very many sniper rifles in the game that are efficient at ad clear. You're most definitely not going to be using them for utility unless you're looking at something from a very far distance, and they don't fill a miscellaneous category. But the rapid fires that I'm going to list off are Irukanji, The Supremacy, and Father's Sins. All incredible, and 2 that sit in the kinetic slot, unfortunately. I hope that we get some more unique ones. A close one that I would also add in for the energy slot would be the Ikelos Sniper, as it has some very, very good roles, and honestly probably is better than Father's Sins, but I'm partial to Father's Sins, so I had to list it. The last special weapon that I'm going to be listing on this is Trace Rifles, and there's only one frame, the Adaptives. Now keep in mind, Trace Rifles are going to fill a number of roles inside Destiny 2, but the 2 that they're absolutely not going to be touching are Damage and Champions. They're great for utility. There's realistically no miscellaneous use, not that we really have seen consistently. And then we have Ad Clear, although Ad Clear probably not your best choice, not the first choice at least. The 2 that I'm going to list are Acacia's Dejection and the Path of Least Resistance. Now, like I said, they fill a number of roles in this game, and their first one is utility. Trace rifles are the go-to for endgame content players, whether it's speedrunners or lowmans, for shooting and activating nodes, panels, and whatever else it may be inside of raids and dungeons, as they just do it really, really well. Keep in mind, like I said, there are some miscellaneous. One that I have listed on here would be Path of Least Resistance, as it has something like Shoot to Loot. Another example is there's a Void Trace Rifle in the game that has a perk on it that gives you an overshield as long as you are shooting a Void debuffed target. So keep in mind, Trace Rifles have some unique interactions, but nothing that's seen super consistently besides Shoot to Loot. Now, lastly, we have power weapons. Yes, that's right. The weapons that use the purple bricks of ammo and have a little less variety than special weapons in regards to their use. However, a lot of these can be used for just about every single category, so keep that in mind. We're going to go through and I'll list each weapon type and what it's mostly used for inside Destiny 2, and then we'll go a little more in depth about some of the recommendations that I have. Starting with grenade launchers, we have 3 different archetypes: adaptives, the compressed wave frame, and rapid fires. By far, adaptives are going to be what you want to use. Until rapid fires get a buff, or compressed wave frames are actually worth using again, we're going to see that adaptive frames are by far the most used and most well received by the community. The 2 that I'm going to list, are Cataphract GL3 and Wendigo GL3. 2 very, very well-rolled adaptive frame grenade launchers that sit in your heavy slot. And if you hadn't guessed already, their main use as a heavy GL is going to be damage for the most part. However, a number of other grenade launchers in this game have perks such as chain reaction, or whether it be destabilizing rounds, whatever it might be. So Ad Clear is a close second. Grenade launchers in the heavy slot are absolutely not used for utility, excluding one exotic option, which we'll talk about in the third video of this 3-part series. As for champions, they can be used to stun champions depending on the artifact mods, but they're also really not the best thing to be using in that instance. Additionally, until very, very recently, I would say that they're not very effective at dealing with champions. However, a bait and switch cataphract is very, very efficient at this, and by far one of my favorite things to use as of late. Quick editor's note, as I was going through this video, I realized I left out 2 grenade launchers. I went on and on about how great adaptive frames were and completely forgot to mention the compressed wave frame and the rapid fire frame that I would recommend going after. For the compressed wave frame, obviously there's only one currently in the game, so dimensional hypertropicoid is definitely something you should get. Have the frame crafted, and in the future, perhaps when we see another time for it, it'll be ready to go. For the rapid fires, until we get something better, Marcelian Sea is realistically the only option you should be going for. With a close second, if you're really stretching things, would be Swarm of the Raven. But it's nothing like what it used to be. Alright, now let's jump back into it. Moving on, we have linear fusion rifles. Now, perhaps you've been playing Destiny for a long time and you know how good linear fusion rifles used to be and their fall from grace. However, let me remind you that they're still very, very good and have a very niche role inside Destiny 2. Linear fusions have some of the best total damage in the entire game. There are 2 archetypes, the precision archetype and the aggressive archetype. The precision, I'm only going to recommend Cataclysmic, as in this current time, we don't have any other precision frame that can keep up with it. And for the aggressives, I'm going to recommend Fire and Forget and Briar's Contempt. Now, you might be calling me crazy because Briar's Contempt is clearly the only one that should be worthwhile, right? But Fire and Forget has a lot of perks on it, including Chill Clip, and it really has some unique interactions when you use it in GMs, and by far is one of my favorite heavy weapons to bring into GMs these days. If I had to pick a frame for linear fusions that I would recommend aggressives, purely because they're a little bit better than precision frames in this day and age. As for what they're used for, well, you guessed it, purely damage. There's not a single frame or really perk combination on any of the linear fusions that's good for ad clear. As for champion stuns, you totally can, depending on the seasonal artifact mods, and they can deal good damage to champions, like I said, and that's probably where their secondary use would be. There's no miscellaneous use, and there's definitely not a utility use on these weapons. Moving on, we have machine guns. Machine guns, we have 3 archetypes: the high impacts, the adaptives, and the rapid fires. Realistically, high impacts should be ignored, as well as rapid fires, and adaptives are the only archetype that should be used. High impacts, however, we do have 2 pretty solid options, being Terminus Horizon and Fixed Odds. Rapid fires, I'm going to list only one, Retrofit Escapade, but the adaptive frames are really where it's at, and realistically, almost any adaptive frame you pick up is going to be really, really good, but there's 2 that stand way above the rest, those being Commemoration and Song of Your Ute, both of which happen to be craftable. Machine guns as a whole really only fill 2 roles in this game, in my opinion, and that would be ad clear and utility. However, as of late, via a number of buffs, we've seen that they can deal with champions fairly well and have been a fan favorite to run in GMs or high-end Nightfalls as of late. Additionally, depending on the perk combination you have, they can deal decent amounts of damage. For a really great example, a lot of people took a machine gun with 4th times and some sort of damage perk such as Firing Line on Commemoration into the Day 1 Root of Nightmares raid, and they used this in tandem with Starfire to have infinite fusion nades and deal a little bit of extra damage with their machine gun. It was a very unique combination and something that we're not going to see a ton of, and unless machine guns receive a large buff to their damage, it's not entirely worthwhile to use them for damage. But as for in regards to ad clear and champion capabilities, machine guns are fantastic, and that's definitely where they should be used the most. Next up, we have rocket launchers, and this is just simply put where the meta is these days. If you're not using a rocket launcher, you're probably throwing to some regard or another, and we'll talk about damage rotations and what I think is best in another video in this series, but for the time being, just try and find a rocket launcher that's on this list. For high impacts and precisions, these are 2 least used archetypes, or they should be at least. They don't really see much playtime because they're not as effective in regards to damage, whether it's total, DPS, or somewhere in between. High impacts, I'm going to recommend Bright Tech Osprey, and precision, I'm going to recommend Royal Entry. However, keep in mind, precision frames these days should more or less be ignored. Now we have two frames that go back to back on whether they're better or worse, and they're definitely tied for first place in my opinion. We have the adaptive frames with the most used Apex Predator, and then second, Hothead. This frame type is incredible and has a very unique perk combinations, but Apex Predator at this point is a must. The aggressive frames, which in my opinion, are my favorite and have some very, very unique rockets in them, but the two that I'm going to recommend are Cold Comfort and Hezen's Vengeance. These are two incredible rocket launchers as well, and like I said, if you're not using a rocket launcher in a raid or dungeon scenario these days, very, very specific scenarios will require other weapon types, I guess I should say first. But using a rocket launcher is definitely the best. And the last four that I list, Apex Predator, Hothead, Cold Comfort, and Hezen's Vengeance, are definitely the best of the rockets in the entire game. So try and find one and use it. As for swords, they're in a really weird spot right now, and the adaptive frames are the only ones that are really worth using in my opinion. The aggressive frames, which are specific to Titans, the Vortex frames, which have a Warlock specific, but we'll talk about that in a second. The adaptive frames, like I said, being by far the best, lightweights, which is a hunter specific, and then the caster frames, which are completely useless in my opinion. As for aggressives, I'm going to recommend Throne Cleaver. It's craftable and has some good perk combinations, but realistically, swords just aren't worth your time in this day and age. Vortex frames, very, very similar. Death's Razor, being the Warlock exclusive, has some unique perk combinations, but nothing to really go crazy about, as well as Thin Precipice. It has some unique perk combinations, but the bigger reason I have it on here is it's Strand, and there's a lot of Strand melee builds, and having a Strand sword can play into them with things such as Banner of War. The adaptive frames, the best of the best. I'm going to list two that make sense, the other half and half truths, as well as a fan favorite as of this season with Crota's End coming back, being Bequest. As for lightweights, we have Quick Fang / Gold Tusk, the same sword, but kind of a waste of time again. And then casters, if I had to pick one, it would be Soulless Scar, but I'd recommend avoiding it as a whole. Now keep in mind, swords are really going to be poor at a lot of these things. Their use, in theory, is somewhere between ad clear and damage, except it's not great for either of those. Bequest has some really good damage, but only on Crota, purely because of Surrounded working and the way that Crota has a sword buff, essentially. As for ad clear, swords are really inefficient for ad clear these days, even if they have something like Chain Reaction or another perk that clears multiple enemies with one sword swipe. So keep that in mind. As for champions, they can be okay, but they're not the most ammo effective. They don't really have many utility options, but they definitely fit the miscellaneous category as Eager Edge exists. And even if it's not Eager Edge, swords in general allow for increased mobility and a little bit more unique movement inside the game, so that's where they're best used. So, we just talked about every single legendary weapon inside Destiny 2, or at least every archetype and weapon type. I hope this gives you a better idea of what you should start looking for. Keep in mind that I recommended a lot of different weapons, but each weapon type had an archetype that was the best, definitively the best, and I'd recommend looking at those first. Also, another very important thing to keep in mind, and we'll discuss this in the third video of the series, is there's a number of exotics that have interactions, or a number of exotics that stand out. Two that I'm going to list right now would be hand cannons. Like I said earlier, hand cannons are very, very good at ad clear, but one of the best currently in the game would be Sunshot. It just happens to be an exotic, so I can't list it when I was talking about this list. But it is very, very effective at ad clear. Another one that I would list would be a rocket launcher that we know as Gallahorn. Gallahorn is very unique to the game and applies a buff, so it would fit in that miscellaneous category. But at the same time, it is by far one of the best options for ad clear in low man content and speedrun content, so keep that in mind. But it in and of itself is very, very poor when it comes to damage. So it has a unique interaction as well and really wouldn't fit the list all that well. So keep in mind, exotics interact with this list very, very differently. Today's video focused only on those legendary weapons. Next up, we'll have a video talking about armor, and we will more or less specifically be looking at all the armor mods, what is worth your time, what is not, and we'll be looking at some of the exotic armor pieces because I don't want to tie those in with the exotic weapon list, as I think that's going to be a little bit too much. So we're going to talk about those as well. What are some meta options for your armor pieces and builds that you have as such? A quick reminder to go down below, like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would very much appreciate that, and it'd help me out a ton. I will catch you guys in the next video, which will hopefully be out soon. With that, I got nothing else to say except for get back to grinding, you crazy guardians.